Okay, welcome to Term 6. This is the third assignment, I believe. We've covered a couple things in the last one, which was posing using stick figures and basic gesture. So what we're going to do this term, is these things, which is like using those same poses to make three-dimensional cylinders to kind of represent the different parts of the human body. And then so the first thing is going to be, well, for beginners, it's going to be practicing those kind of cylinders in perspective, also with squares, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. And then the next part of that would be doing those same cylinders just at different angles, somewhat randomly, and you can rotate them in different angles and just to see what would happen there. And the more you do that, the more you're able to do things that are foreshortening or for extreme dynamic poses. So, and for intermediate, we'll be doing a page of the actual cylinders on top of the wireframes, which you'll see here, and that will be the process video of this drawing will be at the end of this video. You can sort of check that out after I explain everything. And then for advanced, you'll be doing compositions. Actually, let me turn this off. Like this, using perspective grids. I'll show you how to do that as well. And placing characters in them dynamically by creating the cylinder mannequins, whether they're jumping or standing. Just having them in the composition with something foreshortened. In this case, it's the hand. In this case, it's two characters. There's one in the front over here, one in the back, and then I'll do a demo for that in a moment on this far right. And then you'll end up with something like this, and this will be kind of like my example in terms of where it can go. You know, that's kind of the underlay for that. Let's just turn it off completely. And then, yeah, so you can see where that can take you. But let's go back to the beginner stuff, and then we'll kind of get into it. So how do you make a perspective grid like this? So what I like to do is just make a new layer, and you can put a dot here, put a dot over here, or you can just put the first dot, click again and hold shift, and then I'll make a straight line, and that's the second dot. These two are called vanishing points, VP1, VP2. And then you just either make a new layer or use the same one, and you click here, you hold shift, you click over there, right? Click here, hold shift, and click over there. Let go of shift, click shift, or hold, click and hold shift, and you keep doing that until you just have a bunch of lines roughly, well, actually try to be accurate. I'm just kind of doing this as a demo, meeting up over there. So they all converge to this vanishing point. And now this is called two-point perspective, by the way. And then you do the same thing over here. Click over here on VP2, and just click over there. And you'll see that they sort of intersect across the other vanishing lines, and that creates an illusion of perspective. Keep doing that. Right? And so once you have your grid, we're going to use that to sort of practice drawing cylinders on there. So let's do that right now. We can go ahead and get rid of this first grid. Now basically a cylinder is, I mean, just like a Coke can or something, or a roll of paper towels, but let's do one sort of sideways. So basically you would have an ellipse like this, and then obviously if you draw the end of the cylinder, it's going to be smaller in perspective. Why? Because it's following this line here, right? And you know, of course I didn't draw all the way to this line, but I'm imagining that there's a line like that, and so I missed it a little bit, so it wasn't perfect. So there's the back end of the cylinder, and if we kind of fill that in with a line, you can sort of erase this one out and then draw these form following lines. And now it's a cylinder in perspective going to this vanishing point, right? Another way to do that is if you draw you could also practice drawing squares or cubes. So if you do like a straight line up there, straight line here, but you would stop at that vanishing point, or that perspective line, and you kind of just fill that in. So that's the front face of the cube, right? And now we draw from here the other side of the cube, which will be going this way, like that. Now if it's too far, like down over here, then it's not a cube anymore, it's more of a rectangle. Let's actually make it a rectangle. And then if you take this point and draw to there, you literally just erase out over here. Now it's in perspective, right? Now it's a cube, or extended cube as a rectangle in perspective. I think this one needs a face too. right? Now the thing is with this is you can also draw through. So what that means is you can see the other side of it. So if you take this point and draw a line to that perspective vanishing point, you can get the X-ray and line and see through on the other side. And then you could do it again over here, right? And it's sort of seeing through as if it's glass. But then it's like, where do you stop over here? Well, now you have to find out the other vanishing point, or the other line. So if you put a dot here, click all the way over here to that one, and that makes that line, and that will make these two intersect. That's where this will intersect. You could sort of just finish the perspective there. We could go ahead and take that stuff and erase it. Oops. You don't need all that information. So now we can see through the box, the cylinder. Okay, then it's like, what's the point of that? We can use that as our guide to put in a cylinder. So let's actually change the color of this so we can see what's going on. Now we're going to use that as our guide for a cylinder. Now it's actually not a perfect square, so we're going to do a little bit of a tweak here. If it was perfectly square, you could fit in a perfect circle in there, and a perfect circle would be a little bit taller. So let's just draw. Let's just use this as our guidelines. We'll pretend that it's a cylinder that's flattened down a little bit. So if we use that to kind of put in our ellipse in perspective, right? And then over here as well. Actually, the perspective is off on that rectangle because this line should be probably right there. And then if you just connect those lines together like this, now you have a cylinder that's in perspective, sort of bounded by this box. And if you take that away, it looks like it's in perspective. So that's something for you to practice, drawing cubes and cylinders in perspective on a grid. That's the first part. The next part is to sort of test your understanding of perspective and draw these floating cylinders like this. And you've seen this probably in my Instagram feed. I do this a lot as a warm-up. And you just kind of let these two lines converge as if there's a vanishing point over here, right? Because they're literally pointing together towards something. Now, I don't do that dot every time, but that's sort of what my mind sees. I'm implying that there's something over here, and they're all converging. By that I mean these lines here are converging to that point. And I'll draw some ellipses there, and now it looks like a cylinder in perspective. And if you just like do a whole bunch of these, and I'd say probably do a page of this, like imagine if this was, let's see, for example, like if this was our page, I would do, let me just, yeah, you know, probably like a whole bunch just floating around. I know it's a bit sloppy, but you know, like this. And I put these secondary lines to sort of show the form of it and the flow of the actual geometry. You could try, you know, shorter ones like this, so on and so forth. You could even throw in some cubes. But this will help you sort of develop an eye for perspective and how to do foreshortening for your characters if you want to do a dynamic three-dimensional pose, as we'll see later. So that's the first part of the lesson, and that will be part of the assignment. Now, I would recommend doing this every day as a warm-up, but for the sake of the assignment, I'd say do a page, like let's say do this kind of grid with a bunch of cylinders and squares on it. We'll do, let's see, what did we do? We did about, I think, 15 pages of those, but let's make it 10 pages. And give yourself 2 weeks to do that. So 2 weeks of 10 pages of this, and just populate it with a bunch of cylinders. You could even do them standing tall, upright, maybe further back in perspective, maybe one over here that's, you see the top side of the ellipse there. Now the thing about the ellipse is as it gets closer to the horizon, it'll be flat, right? But if you go lower down towards the cone of vision, you'll see more of the circle of it. Right, and so if you kind of connect that all the way through, and even go above the horizon line. By the way, this is the horizon line or the eye level. then the ellipse gets bigger again. Right? So that's what you should practice, 10 pages of, and then I'd say probably just, well, I mean, everyday warm-up, but for the sake of the assignment, let's do also 10 pages of this. Now that's just if you're starting out with perspective and getting an idea of how that is. Now taking it a little bit further would be to use all of that to make these kinds of characters. Now we already did the poses using gestures and lines for the shoulder and the hips, right? Shoulder and the hips. Notice how they're all angled against each other. This one's somewhat parallel, but it's in perspective. Whatever. Sue me. You know, that's something to pay attention to. Even the subtle change of angles for that makes a pretty big difference. And so let me show you how to do that on these characters. So here's our little mannequin, and let's get rid of that. And let's just draw an arrow to show where we started from. And I like to usually just start with either the hip or the ribs, but I'll do a cylinder here. You know, it's conforming to that perspective line, right? I'll put those. I'll do a cylinder here. Actually, let's do the shoulder line first. And those of you who have already had my character design class, this is just a review for you. A cylinder here. It's a bit sloppy, but that's fine. But with these two, I'll actually connect them. Now this represents the top part of the rib cage, or just the whole rib cage in general, because rib cage actually fits in there like this. But I simplified it down to those cylinder things for the sake of you know, simplicity. It's like making a toy. And then for the arm, of course, obviously there's a cylinder here, and I'll put a little floating sphere there at each joint. I'll put one here as well. Cylinder here in perspective. And notice to pay attention to the direction of this form following line. That's going to help you figure out what the direction of the clothing is going to be, or if there's like some kind of band here, or like a wristwatch. Because if you draw the cylinder like that, but then you make it the wrong way, it just looks weird. So you need everything to conform to the perspective of the actual cylinder. So sphere, sphere, sphere. This one's gonna be a little bit tricky. Same thing here. Now for this one, for the forearm, now that's a regular cylinder, but what I like to do is sort of taper it off like a upside down bowling pin. So let's do that again, but make this cylinder, or I'm sorry, ellipse smaller than this one. And what that does is it tapers off like this to imply the wrist tapering off. And I'll also do that here as well. So again, let's put some floating spheres. Cylinder, cylinder. It's a bit sloppy, but you know, but you can see it developing form rather quickly. I'll also put a big, like, you know, bucket for the head as well, and you could sort of subdivide that like this and see where you can point it to aim where the face is going to be aiming. And just take note that this is the underside of the bucket or Coke can or cylinder. And then we'll see the top side of that. I'm going to taper it down like this. Obviously this is stylized. You can push it towards realism if you want, which is going to be not so exaggerated like this. Right, and that's sort of all that I would expect. I'm not really going to get in there and talk about too much of the form of the feet. We can sort of get into that later as we kind of pick apart anatomy. But right now, I think this is a good enough exercise to get you started on dynamic poses. Now, again, what does that look like for a sheet of them? I would say something like this. Just take one page that you already did and do it as a practice just to see how it's like. And I'd say probably, you know, if you really want to get good at it, I'd say do 10 pages, but I think 5 is a good number of these cylinder things. So, but notice how they're all different sizes. You can sort of vary the different proportions. Like obviously this is more like a kid, right? And this is more like an adult. Then we got more of a tanky dwarf looking character, a skinny guy, a wide guy, and it's like once you know that you can change the size of these big cylinders and make them either big like that or small and skinny like that, or long, you can really come up with different archetypal characters and tell a broader story than just having the same exact body all the time. So yeah, and then that's pretty much it for the beginner and intermediate. So how do you do the advanced? So basically, let's say you've already done this, you've already mastered it, you're good to go. Same thing here. So you could set up a grid, but what I'll do here is a pretty simple technique. So basically you make one line, you hold shift and you click down and you have this line, and I'll duplicate it by hitting Control J and then Control T to transform, and I'll hold shift and then rotate it down this way so it snaps into that spot. You could kind of keep going all the way around, but I'll make it snap at 1, right? And then I'll hit enter. And then what you can do is hold Control Alt Shift T, and what that will do is duplicate the same layer and the same transform function. So watch. And you keep hitting that until it goes all the way around back to the start. And now it made all these new layers. What we can do is take them and then merge them down, and now we have a bunch of lines going to the vanishing point. Now what you can do now is either move it over this way, now you have 2-point perspective, throw in a third one, now you have 3-point perspective, right? So it's a bit tricky, but once you get used to it, you can make perspective grids really quickly. You could actually just take this center area and then use that as your grid. Go ahead and just use that part. Right. And yeah, so you'll notice over here I only used one vanishing point. That's fine too, as long as it feels like it's converging. And this is like a more extreme thing, but yeah, so how do you do something in foreshortening? We'll use every technique that we just talked about in terms of using angled shoulders against hips. You can also twist them in this case, but also the cylinder technique. So let's just draw one cylinder. I'm going to actually conform it to this perspective over here. So let's just draw an ellipse like that, and a second ellipse here, and then connect those. That's our kind of shoulder line. And then you could sort of do another one over here. Now that's kind of like the rib cage part. And now the next part is kind of tricky, but what I like to do is work backwards. So what I'll do is put a circle here for the hand, really big, and then sort of find out how it would connect here. And then once I have the joints in place, obviously this is just a placeholder for the hand, but you could put the thumb, fingers, or something. I'm not going to talk about the anatomy of hands just yet, but yeah. So then drawing this cylinder in perspective like this. Remember, it's tapering towards the wrist. And then the second one over here, which represents the top part of the arm, which is the biceps, triceps, and all the other fun stuff. I might have made the hand ball a little bit big. Let's just make it a little bit smaller. Let's put just sticks right now for the fingers. Fine. And then what I can do is draw a bucket for the head. Maybe it's aiming down, looking down, kind of dramatically. I can imagine like light coming from the top left, creating a really nice shadow here, and casting a shadow onto his shoulder there. And then you could draw the other arm, like this or something. But notice how it's much smaller. It's actually technically the same size as this one, but because of the extreme perspective, we have it appearing to be smaller. It's probably a little bit too small. Let's make it bigger. But yeah, something like that. Now it looks like it's in the same perspective, but if we bring it up here, it's obviously technically smaller. Or not, it's visually smaller, but it's technically the same size. And then you could sort of draw a twist of the hips there. Actually, let's get rid of fingers are kind of distracting and in the way right now. And then kind of figure out a nice configuration for the legs. Maybe he's floating in the air and he's got his leg kicked back like that. Right. Let's get those fingers back. Right, and now we have a floating guy. It's pretty boring right now, but as an example, I think it shows you everything that you need to know. Let's do another one without all these guides and stuff. I like to kind of not conform to the perspective, but because I put the grid there to sort of imply the space, but not necessarily use it as I guess, you know, oh, I have to conform to that. But, you know, what if the first cylinder is like this for the shoulders? Notice how it's not necessarily conforming to any of these vanishing points. In fact, this makes its own vanishing point over there somewhere. And like a good piece that's really dynamic has probably like 30 or 40 different vanishing points, because everything you put in there will point to different directions. And then the next cylinder, I could put it like this. Notice how it's angled against it, but it's also twisted this way along this axis. So I have something like that. This is the hips, by the way. And then you have the forearm, elbow. Maybe the head goes over here. It's okay to overlap, by the way. You know, that's kind of what will help make it seem a bit more dynamic. That's the upper arm, forearm, hand, and then the legs kind of converge into space there. There's the lower leg, the foot. Yeah. And then once you have one character, you could sort of put more in the background, maybe another one over here. And you get much faster at it, then you could sort of ideate a whole bunch of them rather quickly and create a nice fun scene that's telling a nice action story. Give him a sword. This one could be a girl. Right, and so that's kind of the assignment. I'd say do probably 10 to 15 comps like this, and then if you want, use that as an underlay for your own characters or fan art, whatever you want to do. Anything that sort of uses the techniques that we talked about and, you know, overlap one character over the other. 3 is a pretty good number for how many characters. That would be a nice challenge for you. And yeah, and also included should be the process of this whole piece as well, if you want to also see how I painted it. But that's the painting and the coloring isn't really the focus of this assignment, but rather the figures in perspective. Anyway, hope that helped, and I you know, hope it was not too long. We covered a lot of material on this, but I look forward to seeing what you do. All right, have fun.